prophet is committed to nonviolence. Okay. I'm not sure if you know who Christian de Chergé is, but the only reason he isn't canonized yet is because he was martyred with 11 other people, and Rome's trying to decide, like, can we do him and not do the other 10 because they all died together, and so on. But he was the abbot of the Trappist monastery in northern Algeria. And in 1996, Al-Qaeda kidnapped the monks, except 2 of them who weren't there. One hid under his bed, and so on. And they took them out, and they killed them all. Okay. But their history with Al-Qaeda, and actually it was interesting. They were a Christian group, Trappists. They were living in northern Algeria in an entirely Muslim area. Okay. They were very, very much loved by the locals, you know, and they kind of became the center of the whole, you know, they were kind of the agricultural center, but they were very, very much loved by the people. But the people were being terrorized, not them. The people were being terrorized by Al-Qaeda, and the monks stayed there because the people felt the monks would be their protection. Okay. Eventually, they were martyred. Okay. But before that happened, they were martyred in May. But on Christmas Eve, the year before, as they were getting set for Mass, you know, the terrorists broke into the monastery with machine guns, and they held people hostage, and there was a medical doctor, and they wanted this medical doctor to come out to some wounded people. But the medical doctor was in his 80s with asthma and not very well. And Christian said, he can't go. He can't go. He said, then we're going to take the medicines. And he said, no, you can't. They're for people here. They're for kids, and so on. And he kind of backed down the leader who was holding his machine gun, and so on. And at a certain point, the leader says, you don't have a choice. He said, hand it over. And he said, well, you don't understand. We do have a choice. And I'm saying no. And then eventually the man backed away and shook his hand. You know, and he's walking away. Christian says to him, he says, you know, this is a special night. You know, he said, why? He said, it's the birth of Jesus. Celebrate Christmas. And the terrorist said, I'm sorry, I didn't know. And they left. And then he began to write letters to this terrorist person, who then actually protected the monastery until he himself was killed by the government. And then, but the interesting was, they broke in to the monastery with machine guns. They held everybody hostage. As soon as they left, from then until the day they died, their prayer was always to say, disarm me. The Trappist prayed, said, in the presence of arms, he said, you pray to be disarmed. He says, disarm me. That was Christian's prayer in his diary again and again. He'd go to chapel and scared. Any night they might get killed, but and the army wanted to come and protect them, and he says, you can't have guns inside of a monastery protecting monks. He said, no. He said, our prayers just, we live with this, we trust in God, we just, in our prayers, disarm me. In the face of, see, this is true prophecy, in the face of guns, you disarm yourself, rather than arm yourself. Now, as we said last week, and come back on this, with pacifism, not everybody can do this. Remember last week we had quite a long discussion on that, and I think it was with this group. Okay. I talked to 3 different groups at the weekend, but I think it was with this group we talked about. Now, see, a prophet always seeks to disarm. Remember last week we said, but not everybody's a prophet. That doesn't mean you can't have cops, and it doesn't mean you can't have soldiers. Remember last week I quoted Cardinal George, and he says, pacifists are to spirituality, he said, and to justice, what celibates are in society, you know, vowed celibates. They're not the majority, it's not the normal occupation, but they point to something beyond, you know. So pacifists point to the fact, in heaven there'll be no guns. Maybe for recreational hunting, but certainly not for shooting people, okay? And see, Dorothy Day and Daniel Berrigan and all these people, and Martin Luther King, they were already there. Dorothy Day said, I just can't imagine Jesus with a gun backing somebody off. Berrigan always says, all violence begets more violence. He says, check it out. In history, he said, violence never stops violence. It stops some skirmish, and then you have more violence, but violence never stops. And each war, produces its next war. Now, I said a prophet seeks to incarnate God's powerlessness. Okay. I want to do a little scriptural excursion here. In the Gospels, you'll often hear this, but they talk about Jesus, and they say Jesus, in his person and in his preaching, had great power. They said he speaks with power, and the scribes and Pharisees don't speak with power. Okay? They said he has great power. Now, that's easy to misunderstand. Okay? In the Greek New Testament, there are 3 words for power, 2 of which we have directly in English. But they all translate as power. One is the word energy, energia in Greek. So that, energy is a form of power. And that's power of strong health, muscle, or firepower. A middle linebacker on a football team at the peak of his career, he has great power. Break you in half. Okay. Energy, muscle is power. Okay. Then they have a second word, which we also have an English word for which we get our word dynamite and dynamic. Dynamis. Dynamite is power. Dynamic is power. So you have, for instance, you can have a speaker who's really energetic. He has energy. You can have a speaker who's very dynamic. Sometimes when you see some of these TV evangelists in mega churches, the speaker has both great energy and great dynamism. They go in front of 6,000 people, and or you see that especially with artists and rock singers. Rock singers have incredible dynamism. They electrify a crowd. They come out and just wham, they shoot the lights out. That's great power. It's great dynamism. Mick Jagger on stage at his best. Okay. Now, they never used those words about Jesus. They never say Jesus was energetic. They never say Jesus was dynamic. They said he has great exousia. We have no word like that in English. Exousia. Okay. That's a Greek word for which we have it means power, but we have no English equivalent for it or in our Western languages. Probably the closest word to it would be the word vulnerability, which is a very different kind of power. Vulnerability is power. Now, we don't have a word for it, but we have an image for it. And the image for exousia is a baby. A baby has great power precisely because it's completely vulnerable and completely powerless. So if you put a football player and a rock star and a baby into a room, who has the most power? Well, they have different kinds of power. The football player has this muscle power. The rock star has this dynamism. The baby has this kind of helplessness and so on, which is a great, powerful moral power, and it works in godly ways. That babies do exorcisms. It's true. Notice we have to watch our language around a baby. It can't even understand. So, careful. No swearing. There's a baby here, and so on. Okay. See, you don't watch your language around football players or rock stars. Okay. In fact, you jack it up a bit. Okay. See, now they say Jesus has this powerlessness. See, and that's also in a certain sense that's the power of nonviolence. See, nonviolence is the ultimate power because it's completely unviolent. It's completely powerless. Incidentally, when you do a theology of God, the Christian God and Jesus, this is central. And it's also why we're also so often frustrated with God. We want God to be powerful on this earth, and that's not the way God works. You see it with the original birth of Jesus. They prayed for years, and they were an oppressed people, and they prayed for a Messiah to come, but they envisaged the Messiah as this person is going to come like the Superman. He's going to come down and he's going to kill all the bad people, throw off the Romans, kill all sinners, and we're just have this pure society. So they envisaged this powerful Superman who'd come and just laser the planet clean. And what did they get? A baby. Helpless. Couldn't change its own diaper. That's God, That's why Jesus was a very big disappointment, It's interesting. You want to understand that. I'll give you the text and see how you would explain this. In one of the Gospels, Mark's Gospel, and Matthew and Luke write it up a little differently. But when Peter makes that famous confession of faith. So Jesus says, who do people say I am? And they said, well, some say you're Elijah, some say you're John the Baptist, come back, and so on. And he says to Peter, who do you say I am? Peter says, you're the Christ. And it's the right answer. You're the Messiah. But notice Jesus shuts him down. Immediately Jesus said, don't tell anybody about that. You know. Why? It's the right answer, but the wrong concept. Scholars will tell you they had about 38 different versions of the Messiah. We don't know which one Peter had, but he had the wrong one. You know, so Jesus, actually, if you read that text, they said, don't tell anybody about that. He said, don't tell anybody about that. You know, the way you think of the Messiah. And then immediately he says, because the Messiah I'm talking about has to go to Jerusalem, be killed. And remember, Peter says, never, don't do it. And Peter says, get behind me, Satan. He said, you're speaking the words of the devil, not of God. He said, I got to go to Jerusalem, I got to be killed. He said, the Messiah that I am, there's a certain powerlessness, and I'm a dying, rising reality. I'm not a Superman. I'm not a king who comes and so on. And it's interesting, and notice that culminates with Jesus on the cross. When Jesus is on the cross, they're jeering him. They said, if you are the Son of God, come off of that cross. Like, show some power, you know. Now, if Hollywood had been doing that, or most religious, they would have brought him off the cross. And he would have done some serious head-banging under the cross and established God's power. It's not the way God works, you know. Julian of Norwich says, God works this way. In the end, all will be well, and all will be well, and every manner of being will be well. But in the end, in the middle, we're going to suffer like everybody else. And God just lies there. You know, you can ignore God for years and years. And there's a great Sufi story. Sufi, Muslim mystic, to tell this story, said, one day was a man was walking with God. They're walking along on a hot day. And the man says to God, he says, tell me the meaning of life. So God said, I will, but I'm thirsty right now. So there's a house there. Go and get me a cup of water, and I'll tell you the meaning of life. So the man knocks on the door. And a very attractive young woman answered the door. He said, could I have a cup of water? She said, sure, you can, but why don't you come and have a meal? Well, 38 years later, okay, they're already grandparents, and he's the mayor of the town, and she's a thriving business. They have wonderful kids and grandkids and so on. And they're in bed one night, and there's a horrific storm, and the house is shaking with wind and thunder and lightning and rain. And the man is very frightened. He says, God, where are you? And God says, waiting for my cup of water. see, that's the way God works. There's no arm twisting. God doesn't work like earthly kings. God is just this patient, present. You know, babies just lie there. They can't do anything to you, except they can stir your moral conscience. They can stir what's best in you. You know, but that's also why it can be so frustrating working with God, because we want God to act with some power. Remember, they were always asking Jesus for miracles. Give us a miracle. And whenever they asked for a miracle, he'd say, an adulterous and evil generation asks for a sign, and no sign will be given it, except the sign of Jonah, which is the resurrection and the miracles that happen in our daily lives and so on. Notice Jesus never did a miracle to ever prove God's existence. He did miracles out of compassion, and sometimes he would do miracles to show what God's power means in the world. You know, that's why it's interesting when you look at all the miracles of Jesus. It's interesting. Most of them have to do with about 4 or 5 physical attributes. So notice, most of the miracles, he opens people's eyes, he opens their ears, they're deaf, or people who can't speak, he loosens their tongue, or people who can't walk, he lets them walk, he gives them their legs back. And in 2 major instances tied together, he gives women back their power to become pregnant and be generative. Okay. Now you probably wonder, where in the hell did that happen? That's the famous text in Mark's Gospel 5, where he is, Jairus, who's the synagogue official, comes and says, my daughter is dying, you know. And this Mark specifies, and she was 13 years old, and his daughter is dying. So he's on his way to the house to try to cure the daughter, when the woman sneaks up in the crowd, the woman with the hemorrhages, and she said, if I touch his, she's been hemorrhaging for 12 years, if I touch his cloak, I'll be healed. She touches his cloak and he's healed. Okay. Then he goes and he raises this girl up from the dead. Okay. there's many aspects to that story. But what is the connection between two women that Mark wants you to get? This. They both were unable to give birth. The one because she was hemorrhaging somehow to do with her, Okay. He gives her back the power. He heals her. And the little girl, that's the age when they got married. They got married at 13. Okay. When they reached puberty. So now she's just ready to get married and have children, and she dies. So he restores to these two women their power to give life. Okay. But all the other miracles, see, your eyes, it's not just a physical miracle. He opens your eyes so that you can now see more deeply. He opens your ears so you can hear the word of God. Opens your mouth so now you can praise God. Gives you legs so now you can walk in the light. You can walk in freedom as God's children. See, the miracles all have a meaning. Notice he never took an appendix out. Maybe a couple of knee replacements, but no appendix. Okay. See, all the miracles have to do with restoring the power to praise God, to always to open you up to something bigger, power to give life, and so on. But it can be so frustrating because God doesn't do miracles to show power. Thomas Halleck, who's a wonderful Czechoslovakian writer, and his last 3 books have been translated into English. And actually, he won the Templeton Award a few years ago, which in theology or spirituality, that's the Nobel Prize. But his second book was a book called Patience with God. It's a wonderful book. Patience with God. And he says, atheism, he said, an atheist is just another word for somebody who isn't patient enough with God. Yeah. See, with God, one day is as 1,000 years. 1,000 years is one day. God simply takes time. Nikos Kazantzakis used to say, human beings are always in a rush, and God is never in a rush. And it's really frustrating. So a prophet commits to nonviolence. Okay. The bottom of it, Berrigan says, be powerless criminals in a time of criminal power. The worse that society gets or something, the more, he said, powerless. Christian de Chergé, disarm me. Just in the presence of guns, just disarm me.